In the autumn of 1923, in a mill town pressed between the Laurentian Hills and the cold gray bend of the Gatineau River, a widow named Cecilia Voss stood trial before a room full of people who had already decided she was guilty. The charge was theft. The evidence was the word of a man whose word had never been questioned. And the sentence, if it held, would cost her the only thing she had left: the small logging supply business her husband had built with 16 years of careful work, and that she had kept running for 3 years since his death, alone, without asking anyone for help. The man pressing the charge was Douglas Holt, a timber merchant from Ottawa who controlled the contracts for half the mills in the valley. He had offered to buy Cecilia's supply business the previous spring. She had declined. By September, he had accused her of shorting his last delivery by 40 board feet of cedar planking. The town constable had no choice but to act. Douglas Holt's contracts kept 4 families employed. His displeasure had consequences. What Douglas Holt had not counted on was that Ewan Calloway, the man appointed to arbitrate the dispute, had spent the previous winter working a logging camp near Pembroke and had learned to measure timber by eye as accurately as most men could with a rod. Ewan Calloway was 44 years old. He had come to Briar Falls 3 years earlier from New Brunswick. Following work the way men did after grief left them with no reason to stay in one place. His wife had died of a fever in 1920. He had no children. He ran a small assay and measurement office out of a rented building on Caldwell Street, and he was known in the valley less for warmth than for precision. He did not socialize. He did not attend church regularly. He kept his books perfectly and his opinions to himself. He had been appointed arbitrator because both parties had agreed to it. Douglas, because he assumed any reasonable man would side with a timber merchant over a widow, and Cecilia, because she had no money for a lawyer. And Ewan Calloway's reputation for exactness was the only thing she had to bet on. On the morning of the arbitration, Briar Falls filled the mill office as if it were a church social. They lined the walls. They stood in the doorway. A woman had accused Douglas Holt of lying, in effect. That was worth leaving a hot stove for. Cecilia Voss arrived without a lawyer, without an advocate, without anyone beside her. She wore her husband's ledger under her arm, and her back so straight. It looked deliberate. She was 36 years old, and the town had not known what to make of her since Gerald's funeral. A widow who kept working instead of selling. A woman who haggled over timber prices with men twice her size and wrote her own invoices. And never, not once, asked anyone to feel sorry for her. There was something about that combination that made people uneasy. They respected it the way they respected cold weather, from a distance and with a certain resentment. She took her seat across the table from Douglas Holt. He settled into his chair with the ease of a man who had never lost an argument he'd decided to win. He was 60, well-dressed, with the kind of certainty that comes from decades of people giving way. Ewan sat at the head of the table. He looked at neither of them as he arranged his papers. He had read the delivery records twice the night before. He had done his own calculations. He had not slept well. The hearing took 2 hours. Douglas presented his foreman, who testified to the short count. Cecilia presented her own delivery log, her supplier's bill of lading, and a witness statement from her driver, young Pete Findlay, who confirmed the load had left her yard complete. Douglas's lawyer called Pete's testimony unreliable. He called Cecilia's record-keeping a widow's guesswork. He used the word twice, guesswork, and both times something in the room shifted just slightly, the way a floorboard bends before it cracks. Cecilia said nothing. She kept her hands flat on the table. Her face did not change. But Ewan, who had been watching her more carefully than he intended to, saw the small adjustment she made with her jaw. He recognized it. It was the expression of someone who had learned to absorb insults by converting them into ballast. When Douglas's lawyer finished, Ewan asked to see the delivery yard. Douglas said it wasn't necessary. Ewan said he'd like to see it anyway. Douglas, yet the timber in question had long since been moved. Ewan said he understood that, and he'd still like to see the yard. The crowd followed them out, because small towns do not let a drama this good end indoors. The delivery yard sat behind Cecilia's warehouse on the riverside of Main Street. It was tidy in the way that places kept by people with limited help tend to be tidy, organized out of necessity rather than comfort. Rope coiled on proper hooks. Tools hung where they could be found fast. A ledger nail on every post. Ewan walked the length of the receiving dock without speaking. He measured the loading bay by step and converted it in his head. He looked at the plank marks on the dock boards, the depth of the compression impressions left by a loaded cart. He stood at the back of the yard for a long moment with his hands in his coat pockets. Then he turned and looked at Douglas Holt. "Your load left this yard complete," he said. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either an argument or an admission. Douglas chose the argument. He spoke at length about the integrity of his foreman, the impossibility of error in his counting process, the implausibility of a woman understanding the complexities of timber volume calculations. Ewan let him finish. "I've measured 14,000 board feet of timber in the past year," he said, when Douglas stopped for breath. "I've done it in 6 different camps in 2 provinces. The compression marks on that dock board are consistent with a full load of cedar planking within normal variance. Your shortfall, if there was one, did not originate in this yard." More silence. Of a different kind. Douglas Holt looked at him with the flat expression of a man recalibrating a situation he'd thought was settled. "You're taking a widow's word over mine," he said. "I'm taking the yard's evidence," Ewan said, "over an accusation without physical support." That evening, Briar Falls processed what had happened with the efficiency of a place that runs on talk. By supper, the verdict had been parsed, questioned, and argued in 4 separate kitchens. By nightfall, the story had arranged itself into something the town could understand. A fair man had done a fair thing. A woman had been vindicated. What the town did not know, because it had not been watching closely enough, was what happened after the hearing ended. Cecilia had walked back to her warehouse alone. She had taken the ledger from under her arm, placed it on her desk, and sat down in her husband's old chair, and put her hands over her face. Not weeping. Just breathing, the way a person breathes when they've been holding something for a very long time, and can finally, for just a moment, set it down. Ewan Calloway had not gone straight home. He had walked past the warehouse twice. The second time, he had seen the light on above the loading dock and had stopped. He had stood on the street for longer than made sense. Then he had gone home. He told himself that the case was closed. He reminded himself that he had simply done his job. He was very nearly convinced. The following week, Douglas Holt's lawyer sent a letter contesting the arbitration finding on procedural grounds. The matter would go to a formal review before the county magistrate in Pembroke. It would take 3 months. In the meantime, Douglas quietly suggested to 2 of his connected associates that Cecilia Voss's supplier credit might be worth reassessing, and whether her remaining timber contracts were really as solid as her ledgers made them appear. Briar Falls received this information, the way it received all uncomfortable truths, slowly at secondhand, wrapped in the language of concern. People began to wonder in that particular way that sounds like worry, but functions like judgment, whether Cecilia could survive a formal challenge, whether a woman running a business alone could really be expected to navigate county proceedings, whether it might be time for her to consider selling. Margaret Beach, who ran the dry goods store and had known Cecilia since before Gerald died, said flatly that Cecilia Voss was the most capable woman in the valley, and everyone saying otherwise should be ashamed of themselves. This was noted and mostly ignored. Cecilia heard the talk from her driver Pete, who reported it without editorializing, which she appreciated. She sat with it for a day. Then she wrote 3 letters. One to her supplier, reaffirming their arrangement. One to her best remaining customer, requesting a meeting. And one to Ewan Calloway, asking if he would be willing to appear as a witness at the Pembroke review. Ewan received the letter on a Thursday morning. He read it standing at his desk. He read it again, then he set it down, put on his coat, and walked to Cecilia's warehouse. She was in the yard when he arrived, checking a fresh delivery with Pete Findlay. She did not stop what she was doing until the count was finished and the bill signed. Ewan waited. He noticed that she did not rush the work because he was watching. He noticed that Pete treated her with the ease of someone who has worked for a person long enough to know exactly how much they can trust them. When she came to him, she said, "You didn't need to come in person." "I know," he said. A pause. The river moved below them in its slow fall way, brown with clay and cold. "I'll appear at the review," he said. "You don't need to ask twice." She looked at him with the same careful, measuring look she'd given Douglas Holt across the arbitration table. He had the feeling she was assessing whether he meant it simply, or whether there was something else underneath. "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I know that too," he said. She nodded once. "Then thank you." He walked back to Caldwell Street. He spent the rest of the afternoon trying to focus on a surveying report and making very little progress. The 3 months between the arbitration and the Pembroke review passed the way that difficult waiting periods do, too slowly in the middle and too fast at the edges. Cecilia kept the business moving. She renegotiated 2 supply agreements that had gone soft in the uncertainty. She drove to Pembroke herself in October to review the procedural requirements with the magistrate's clerk, because she had learned early that understanding a process was the only reliable defense against being misled by someone who understood it better. She came back with 4 pages of notes in her careful handwriting and a clearer sense of exactly how much Douglas Holt's challenge was going to cost her if she let it succeed. She did not ask Ewan for help with any of this, but twice during those months she passed him on Caldwell Street and stopped, once to tell him the date had been set, once to pass along a correction to a measurement report his office had sent to a local mill, which she'd noticed while reviewing her own records. The correction was minor. She mentioned it without apology or softening. He thanked her without making it remarkable. He thought about those 2 conversations more than was strictly warranted. In November, the first serious snow came early to the Gatineau Valley, arriving on a Sunday night, when no one had quite prepared for it. By Monday morning, the road to the river was glazed. The dock ladders were sheeted with ice, and 3 of the warehouse's overhead pulley lines had frozen solid. Cecilia was on the dock at first light with a lantern and a brush, working the lines free before her morning delivery arrived. Because if the delivery had to be rescheduled, she would lose the day's work and possibly a contract, and she could not afford either. She was halfway through the second line when the ladder she was standing on shifted, ice under the base. She caught the dock rail with one hand and held on, the lantern swinging, the ladder grating against the dock boards. For a moment she was very still, very high up, and very alone. Then a voice from below said, "Hold what you've got. Don't shift your weight." She looked down. Ewan Calloway was at the base of the ladder, both hands on the uprights, steadying it from beneath. His coat was open. He had clearly been walking past and come straight over without stopping to button up. "The base slid," he said. "I've got it now. Take your time." She took her time. She finished the line. She came down the ladder with the lantern in one hand and stepped onto the dock. Ewan's hands came off the uprights. He stepped back to a reasonable distance. He did not make anything of it. "Thank you," she said. "The ice caught wrong," he said. "It'll need sand under the base." "I know," she said. "I was going to do it after." "Right," he said. She looked at him for a moment. The river was loud below them. Ice cracked somewhere upstream. "You were walking past," she said. "I walk this way in the morning," he said. "It's a direct route." "It is," she agreed. Something moved between them in the cold air. Not large, not declared, just there, the way the river was there, always audible, not always attended to. "I'll bring sand," he said, and walked back toward the street. He came back with a bucket of sand from the assay office's supply store and set it down on the dock without further comment. She was already back on the ladder. He sanded the base of every ladder on the dock, working steadily from one end to the other, and left without being asked to stay. Pete Findlay arrived an hour later with the delivery and saw the sanded bases and said, "Huh. Someone came by early." Cecilia told him the buckets needed refilling before the afternoon. Pete refilled them without asking anything else. That evening, Ewan ate his supper at his desk, something he often did when he was working and not in the habit of noticing the absence of company. He noticed it that evening. He sat with that for a while. He did not know what to do with it. He had been 44 years old for 7 months. And he still did not entirely know what to do with the fact that he was not the kind of man who reached for things anymore. He had stopped reaching for things after 1920. It had seemed like the responsible choice, like keeping a fire banked so the house didn't burn and nobody else got hurt. He washed his dish. He read for an hour. He went to sleep thinking about the angle of the dock ladder and the way Cecilia Voss had finished the work before she came down. The Pembroke Review was held on the second Tuesday of December in a wood-paneled room that smelled of wood smoke and old paper. Magistrate Dunbar presided. He was a precise man in his 60s who had, in 20 years on the bench, developed an efficient contempt for time wasters and an almost scientific interest in evidence. Douglas Holt arrived with 2 lawyers. Cecilia arrived with Ewan and her ledger. The proceeding was formal and thorough. Douglas's lawyers argued procedural grounds, that the original arbitration had exceeded its scope and that a commercial dispute of this magnitude required properly licensed legal arbitration, not a measurement office holder, with no specific commercial mandate. It was, Cecilia understood, a clever argument. It was not about whether she was right. It was about whether the process that had found her right was valid. Magistrate Dunbar let the argument run for 40 minutes. Then he asked Ewan to speak to the evidentiary basis of his finding. Ewan stood and spoke for 12 minutes. He described his methodology. He cited the specific measurements, the compression analysis, the variance standards applied in commercial timber delivery disputes in Ontario and Quebec. He spoke without notes, without hesitation, and without any of the deference that Douglas's lawyers had clearly expected. He answered 3 questions from the magistrate with the same quiet precision he had used to answers Cecilia's question in the yard 3 months earlier. When he sat down, Magistrate Dunbar made a note, set down his pen, and said that the evidentiary basis of the arbitration finding appeared sound, and that, absent any procedural irregularity that hadn't been demonstrated, he found no grounds to overturn it. Douglas Holt did not speak during the short recess that followed. His lead lawyer spoke quietly to him for several minutes. Douglas nodded twice. His face held the particular expression of a man who is revising a plan rather than accepting a defeat. Outside in the corridor, Cecilia stood near the window that overlooked the street. The town of Pembroke moved below in its winter way, slow and considered. Ewan stood nearby, his coat on, his case file tucked under his arm. "That's it," she said. "The ruling stands," he said. "His options narrow from here." She turned and looked at him directly. She had a way of doing that, of not softening the directness with a smile or a deflection. "You didn't have to be this thorough," she said. "I was doing my job," he said. "You were doing more than that," she said, "and it was not an accusation. It was an observation, made carefully, the way she made all her observations." He looked out the window for a moment. Below, a woman was hurrying across the street with a bundle under her arm, head down against the wind. "You're right," he said. "I was." The silence that followed was different from the silences they'd had before. It had a shape. It was aware of itself. "I'd like to buy you supper," Cecilia said, "if you're not needed elsewhere." He was not needed elsewhere. "All right," he said. They ate at a small restaurant near the river. They talked about the mill contracts, about the valley's timber future, about what the new rail line to Maniwaki was going to do to the supply routes in the spring. They talked for 2 hours. At some point, the conversation moved from business to other things. The New Brunswick coast. The particular quality of the Gatineau in September. What it was like to keep a record of someone's life in ledger form. Which was what both of them did, in different ways. Cecilia talked about Gerald once, briefly, without looking away from the window. She said he had been a careful man and that she had been grateful for his carefulness, even when it frustrated her. She said she did not regret the 3 years she'd spent continuing his work. She said she did not always know what she was building it toward. Ewan said he understood that. She looked at him. "I think you might," she said. They drove back to Briar Falls in his borrowed automobile through 2 inches of new snow. The road was quiet. The hills held the darkness the way hills do in winter, deeply and without drama. They did not talk much on the drive, but it was the comfortable quiet of people who no longer need to fill space to prove they're at ease. When they reached her warehouse, he stopped the car. She did not get out immediately. "The spring contracts start in March," she said. "If Douglas circles back through other channels, I may need you again." "I'll be available," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to be available for business reasons," she said. The sentence sat between them, plainly said, "not dressed up." "I know," he said. "I'm asking because I'd like the company," she said. "And I don't usually ask for things I don't mean." He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the banked fire. He thought about 3 years of eating supper at his desk. He thought about the dock ladder and the way she'd finished the work before she came down. "I'd like the company too," he said. She nodded once. "Good." She got out of the car. At the warehouse door she paused and looked back. "Good night, Mr. Calloway." "Good night," he said. He drove back to Caldwell Street. He sat in the car for a moment after he parked it. Above the assay office, the light was on in his window where he'd left it burning. He had never noticed how small that light looked before. One window in a rented building in a town he'd arrived in following grief. He was still 44 years old. He was still not a man who reached for things easily. But something had shifted slightly in the architecture of what seemed possible, the way a door shifts when the foundation settles, and it no longer swings freely in either direction. He went inside. He made tea. He sat at his desk, but he did not open the surveying report. He thought about March. He thought about spring contracts and supply routes and the Gatineau in September. He thought about what it meant to keep building something when you didn't always know what you were building it toward. He thought that maybe not knowing was not the same as having nowhere to go. The following morning, he walked his usual route past the warehouse. The dock ladders were sanded. The loading door was open. Cecilia was at her desk inside, visible through the window, writing in the ledger. She did not look up. She did not need to. He walked on to Caldwell Street. He opened the office. He started the stove. Outside, the Gatineau moved under its first hard skin of ice, dark water, pressing forward beneath it, cold and constant and going somewhere it had always been going. It was going to be a long winter. That was all right. He had learned, slowly and at some cost, that long winters ended. That the river ran again in April. That some things, kept carefully, did not break in the cold but only waited. Douglas Holt made no further moves against Cecilia Voss that season. By February, it was quietly understood that pursuing the matter further would cost more than it was worth. The supplier credit that had wobbled through November steadied. The spring contracts came in on schedule. What the town of Briar Falls noticed, and processed with its usual efficiency, was that Ewan Calloway had taken to spending Sunday afternoons at the warehouse. Not every Sunday, but enough. They were seen on the road to Pembroke twice before March arrived. They were seen at the community hall supper in February, not together exactly, but adjacent, in the way that people stand when the proximity is the point. Cecilia's business ran another season, and then another. She kept Gerald's ledger on the desk and her own beside it. She hired a second driver in the spring. She renegotiated the cedar contract at terms that her husband had never managed to get. She did not ask anyone what they thought about any of it. She had stopped waiting for the town's permission to take up the space she needed. Ewan, for his part, found that supper at his desk happened less often. He found that the walk past the warehouse in the morning had become a thing he did without deciding to. He found that the light in his rented window looked different when he knew he would have somewhere to be on Sunday. He was not a man who said large things. He was a man who showed up when the ice was wrong under the ladder. He was a man who stayed until the last dock base was sanded and then went home without making anything of it. He was a man who told the truth in a room full of people who assumed he would find it easier not to, because he had decided long ago that the truth was the only thing that didn't cost more on the back end. That was what Cecilia Voss had understood about him from the beginning, and what he had understood about her. Not everything, but enough. And in Briar Falls, in the autumn of 1923, where the Gatineau ran cold and the sills kept running and the hills held the darkness in winter and let it go in spring, enough was not a small thing. It was, in fact, exactly what a life could be built from.